Hello, thank you so much for clicking on this video. What I thought I would do today is introduce myself. This is maybe my fifth video now, and I realised that I've never introduced myself. So what I thought we could do is via 12 of my favourite authors and some of my favourite books from them, I will just introduce myself as we run through each book. The way that I have split this up is favourite classics, favourite 20th century, and then some non-fiction. But each book is kind of meant to allow me to introduce myself and for you to get to know me better. I should say that I have a cup of tea with me. You might want tea or a coffee depending on when you're watching this. I'm filming this on the weekend, but I know it will go live on Tuesday, so I hope that you're having a lovely week wherever you are. So first up, let's head to our Victorian classics. First on the list is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. I have chose this one because it's a really good example of the type of classics that I like to read, but also the Brontes were really important for me in developing as a reader who loves to read classics. After Jane Austen, they were the first books that I chose to head to myself. Now, what I will say is, if you'd asked me 10 years ago what is my favourite novel, I almost certainly would have told you Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. I have this theory that as a teenager, people generally head to Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. As they get a little bit older, they get into Charlotte, and then, like me, if you're in your 30s, you kind of come to the realization that perhaps Anne Brontë is the most radical or accomplished of all of the sisters. But I absolutely love this novel. It's a little bit bleak. It's a Brontë novel, so obviously you would expect that. This, I think, is the most radical of all of the Brontë sisters. I won't give kind of too much plot away in this, other than to say that I think that this is the most advanced in its thinking, the most forward thinking, the most radical. And when I read this, I reread this again about 8 years ago. 8 years ago, blimey, and I think she was doing things that the other two perhaps weren't. One of the things that I will say, and I will mention this as I go through for different editions, is that some of these books I have in cloth-bound editions. Now, I don't buy cloth-bound editions anymore, and I generally don't recommend that people do either. That is because they wear really poorly. You can't see on this one, but the illustration, this fades off very quickly when you're actually reading it. What I'm doing with my cloth bounds is that the next time I come to read them, I'm replacing them with Penguin Black Classics. But obviously, until they start to fade, I'm not going to go ahead and do that just yet. That is my first novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I could have picked Jane Eyre, I could have picked Villette or Wuthering Heights, but this is currently my favourite of all of those. More so, I love to go to Haworth, which is where the Brontë Parsonage Museum is. I've been a fair few times now. I've stayed there as well. You really get a good impression of kind of what their lives were like. So, onto our next novel, which is, and I have a kind of two editions of this and one fancy one, which I'll run through. Next novel is Middlemarch by George Eliot. Again, a Victorian writer. This is, I would say, currently my favourite, what I think is the most accomplished novel that I've ever read. I can't really articulate into words just how good I think this is. This is the Penguin Threads edition, and this is the edition that I generally read from. My mum did get me this beautiful folio edition for Christmas about 5 years ago now. This is so stunning, but obviously it's very big and I don't generally read from it, but it's lovely to have on my shelf. See if I can show you some of the illustrations, because it is absolutely stunning. I don't know if you can see that, but it's so beautiful. I do sometimes buy folios, but generally only for books that I am very, very, very fond of. Let's put that one back in. Middlemarch is a mid-19th century Victorian novel, like all George Eliot's novels. It's very focused on realism. This is set in the town of Middlemarch, and you follow the inhabitants of Middlemarch. There's an awful lot of characters in this book, but the main ones are Dorothea Buck, Will Laderslaw, Tertius Lydgate, and Rosamund Vincy. I have read this 3 times now, and interestingly with this one, this took me 3 goes originally to crack it. I always got to, if you know Middlemarch, about page I always got to the point where Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon were honeymooning in Rome, and then I would always kind of drift off. But what I will say about Middlemarch, and one of the things that I've really learned over time, and the reason why I included this, is that what you invest in Middlemarch, and you do have to work a lot for this novel, you get back 10 times. And I last reread this last summer. I listened to an audiobook. I think it's by Julia Aubrey. I'm not sure I have that name correct, but it is by the actress who played Dorothea in the BBC, I think it's 1994 adaptation. It's a fantastic Middlemarch. I listened to that over the course of 2 or 3 months, and it was probably my best reading experience of the whole year. I have a video coming up which is all about a few changes I've made in terms of how to refocus on deep reading, and that was a kind of revelatory experience for me. But my favourite novel of all time, George Eliot. I have another Victorian classic coming up, but I also wanted to say that, I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have a lot of Thomas Hardy. The Woodlanders could be in here. Far from the Mud and Crowd could be in here. I don't get on along so well with Dickens, but I do have some favourites. I really like Great Expectations, Bleak House, but George Eliot is, for me, the ultimate novelist. So that is Middlemarch. Right, next up is my last of the Victorian novels, and then we are heading to the 20th century. So up next is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. Again, generally, just as a disclaimer, I don't generally buy Penguin English Library anymore. I generally buy Black Classics, but I wouldn't replace this until this one kind of falls apart. I don't know how many times I've read North and South, probably an awful lot. Also, this is one of my favourite adaptations of any novel anywhere. But North and South, for anyone who doesn't know, follows the main character of Margaret Hale and John Thornton. Margaret Hale moves with her family to the north of England to a town called Milton, and her family become acquainted with one of the mill owners, John Thornton. This novel is just perfection, just absolute perfection. It's one of the best kind of love stories. Again, it's very, all of the Victorian novelists I've picked are all kind of the into like realism. It has its kind of like radical moments with concerning like workers' rights in kind of 19th century like mills in the north of England. I really love this. It's also really interesting. Obviously, it's focused a lot on kind of differences between like the north of England industrial heartland during the Industrial Revolution and the south of England. I'm from the north of England, so there you go. But I love Elizabeth Gaskell. I've been to Elizabeth Gaskell's house in Manchester, which I really highly recommend. But this novel has been a fan favourite of mine for over 10 or 12 years. I have other Elizabeth Gaskells that I always head to, but any list of like my favourite authors or my favourite books, you will see Elizabeth Gaskell on there. This year I'd really love to get to Mary Barton, and I'd also really love to get to the Gothic Tales, which I included in a book haul last week, which will be on the channel. I'll link it below as well, but that is North and South. Right, that is it for the Victorians. Now, I haven't included some authors in here, and it's only because I have spoken about them quite a lot recently. I haven't included any Jane Austen, but it goes without saying that she is really important to me. So yeah, just a disclaimer that this isn't necessarily my like best favorite authors or best books ever. It's more just in a way to like introduce myself. Right, heading on to our next book. We are headed into Edwardian England, into the 20th century. I believe this was published in 1901, and it is E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. Now, there is a trinity of E.M. Forster novels, A Passage to India, A Room with a View, and Howard's End, that are all to me as perfect as novels can be. The Edwardian period and then the interwar period are two of my favourite times for fiction, especially like British English fiction. The reason why I've chosen A Passage to India instead of the other two is because I last reread this last year, so it's probably a little bit fresher in my head. This is a really well developed, quite complex character study, but also within the context of British Empire. Events in this obviously happened during India, and it is a really, I think, advanced critique of empire and what that does on a kind of individual and interpersonal level. There is an event that happens in this. I don't want to give away too many plot spoilers, but there is an event that happens to this to one of the female characters, and it's really interesting in what he does with this, because you never know whether she's telling the truth or whether she's mistaken intentionally or not. And I also think the interplay between some of the British characters and the Indian characters is just absolutely fascinating. But like I said, I could have picked Howard's End. I could have picked A Room with a View. Before I actually read E.M. Forster, I was familiar with quite a lot of the stories because I grew up watching an awful lot of Merchant Ivory adaptations. I've also picked this because he was kind of on the periphery of the Bloomsbury Group, which is a literary circle that I'm really interested in. I have a lot of Virginia Woolf on my shelf. I'm also really interested in her sister Vanessa Bell, who is an artist, Catherine Mansfield, Julia Strickey. I love that circle and the works that they produced, so that's also another reason why he's on this list. Okay, next up, we're still in the 20th century, and we're going to go to one of my favourite writers, Daphne du Maurier. This is Rebecca. There are many things that I love about Daphne du Maurier, but one of them is just how fun her novels are. I love how they're plotted, they're written beautifully, they're fun, they're twisty, they're dark. I also love the sense of place in like Cornwall. I've been to Jamaica Inn, which is a novel that I also love by her. I also really love My Cousin Rachel. There's so many good novels to choose from her. She's one of my favourite 20th century writers. Next up, we're headed to a slightly different genre, and that is crime fiction. I am quite a big fan of crime fiction, but it's mainly golden age crime fiction. The book that I've chosen for this is Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. This is a standalone Agatha Christie. I have so many favourites from her, whether that's Poirot or Miss Marple. I also really like the Tommy and Tuppence series. This is the standalone one of the best-selling novels of all time. So I won't go into the plot other than to say that this has the absolute most fantastic twist in it. And it's atmospheric and it's dark, just a perfect Christie novel. This is a facsimile edition. I don't think you can get these anymore. I think that they are definitely out of print, but these are fantastic little editions that were not expensive at all, and they are basically the covers from when it was originally published. So yeah, this is a standalone, but like I said, I love this series. I'm kind of slowly, when I originally started reading Agatha Christie, I just kind of read whichever ones I could get my hands on. I am slowly trying to go back and read them in kind of publication order, and that's Poirot and Miss Marple. I last read Why Didn't They Ask Evans? I read that at the end of the year, but generally in terms of like golden age crime, I read a lot of the British Library crime classics. I also like Patricia Highsmith, just a genre that I'm really fond of. So you will see those popping up quite a lot. They're usually the books that I go to when I've read something quite taxing and I like want a little break. I usually go to Agatha Christie or P.G. Wodehouse, and I always have a good time. Um, there's always fantastic plotting. The writing is great. What's not? What's not to love? Next up, we're still in the 20th century, but I have chosen a non-fiction work. I mentioned this author in my last book haul, but this one is A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. This is a work of non-fiction and it's centered around his life in Paris in the 1920s. I think Ernest Hemingway is one of the best writers that we have, and he's a really interesting writer for me because when I was a little bit younger, say in my like early to mid 20s, I kind of disregarded him because I was familiar enough with his life to know that he probably wasn't the nicest man. But when I read one of the first novels that I read by him, which is The Sun Also Rises, I just came to the conclusion that that may well be the case, but his writing is truly some of the best that you can read. But this is A Movable Feast. One of the things that I love about this is the cast of characters that pop up. You have Ford Madox Ford, who wrote Parade's End and The Good Soldier in this. You obviously have F. Scott Fitzgerald in this. You have his first wife Hadley, you have Zelda Fitzgerald, and you have lots of writers around Gertrude Stein. There's just tons of like interesting characters. Some of the comic scenes in this are just second to none. But I wanted an Ernest Hemingway in here because 20th century is really the kind of time period that I'm most fond of in terms of reading, and it would be incomplete without an Ernest Hemingway. Right, so now we're moving to contemporary fiction. Fiction published, I would say, from like the 90s onwards. I've chosen two titles, two of my favourites. The reason why I've included these is because I have a difficult-ish relationship with contemporary fiction. I used to be a bookseller. Before I was a bookseller, I read very similarly to all of the books I've just introduced, modern classics, crime. That was what I enjoyed, that was what I read. When I became a bookseller, I moved to reading much more contemporary fiction. My job was focused on fiction, that's kind of what I was an expert in. Then I became a book buyer and it just kind of stepped that process up. However, I haven't been a bookseller for a fair old while now, and I've really removed myself from that kind of hamster wheel of trying to keep up with contemporary frontlist fiction. So I don't really read from like book prizes anymore. I want to make a whole video on this because I find the culture around book prizes and like reading shortlists and long lists so interesting, but I'm getting sidetracked. But all of this to say that now I am very picky with contemporary fiction because what I had noticed was happening is that I was, sometimes or occasionally finding some exceptional books, but more often than not, I was wading through an awful lot of kind of just okay books, and so I had the ratio of good to just okay or good to bad was really not working out for me. And so now I'm much more cautious about book marketing, about hypes around books, about taking recommendations about contemporary fiction. I rarely do, or I really have come to the realization that actually in terms of my reading, I do want to read the best that I can, and I don't want to invest my time and energy without kind of getting back what I wanted. So one of the things that I do with my TBRs is I have different like TBRs for classics, for non-fiction, that's where the non-fiction bookcase is, and then for contemporary fiction. For contemporary frontlist fiction, I generally like to keep a TBR under 15. By the end of the year, I'd love, well, the aim is to get that down to under 5, because I have spent spent a very long time working my TBR down to a more manageable level because I found that that's the contemporary fiction is the stuff that I was leaving to linger on my shelves. But The first book is, and this was published, I think, in the 90s. Oh no, at the very end of the 80s, 1989. So I mean contemporary. This is The Remains of the Day. I chose this because Kazuo Ishiguro is, I think, probably the only author that is publishing today that I would buy a hardback of. I have a signed copy, a dedicated copy of The Buried Giant. I went to a book signing that he was doing in Manchester, and that is like one of my prized possessions. He is the only author that's currently alive that's publishing that I would pre-order any book from and give it a go. End of the Day is set in the 1950s. It follows a butler called Stevens who is reflecting on his life. This is very slow, very reflective, very calm. It's a really moving account of him looking back at the decisions that he's made and reflecting on those. This also has a fantastic Merchant Ivory film with Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins, which I really recommend. But this is just absolutely incredible. Obviously, Kazuo Ishiguro is a Nobel laureate now. I also really like Never Let Me Go. I like The Buried Giant, less so Clara and the Sun, but he is an author that I will always pick up. Next up is the second contemporary novel on the list, which is Hilary Mantel, Bring Up the Bodies. Hilary Mantel is no longer with us, which I still find like absolutely devastating. I picked this because I do really love historical fiction, and this is the kind of Wildfell series, the Thomas Cromwell series, is the best historical series, the best historical novels that you can possibly find. I'm also a really big fan of her kind of essays, but this is another example of previously anything that she had written, I would pick up. An author that I adore. I really want to get to her French Revolution novel, A Place of Greater Safety. The next three books that I have are all non-fiction, and I've chosen three that are all from different genres of non-fiction, and I'll kind of talk through the reasons why. First off, I have this, which is The Silent Woman, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. This is by Janet Malcom. I chose this because I love literary biographies. It is a genre, a type of biography that I've really gotten into, that I find when I love a book or an author or a genre or a circle. I love reading around them. I love going more in depth. I just think that there's so much to be gained by that type of deep, involved reading. Also with a little bit of a helping hand in terms of the context, significance, etc. This is the best example of a literary biography I've ever read. It's very short. Last time I read this about 2 years ago, I made a lot of like tabs. I don't tab my books anymore, but this is really interesting because this is a biography on Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, but it's also a biography on biographies and a biography on readers' relationships to authors and how ethical that is. And there isn't a better example of that than Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. I could not speak more highly about this. I think I've read this 2 or 3 times now, and it blows me away every single time. Last year when I read Middlemarch, I read a literary biography called The Road to Middlemarch by Rebecca Eaton, and again I took so much out of that. I also read Take 6 Girls, which is a biography of the Mitford sisters. Yeah, so you'll probably see a fair few literary biographies popping up. I have one on Byron, and that kind of the kind of romanticism circle coming up soon as well. But this one is a fantastic one, highly recommend. Next up, we're headed to nature writing. I now work in kind of the outdoors, nature space, without giving away too many details, but I've chosen an author and a book that had a really big impact on me. And I first read this author during lockdowns. I read 3 of his books back to back. The one that I've chosen is Waterlog, and this is by Roger Deakin. Roger Deakin is basically like the father of nature writing, and he is also like He popularised wild swimming in the UK. But he is the most incredible writer, and he's a writer of like writers. He's also really into reading. Daphne du Maurier pops up quite a lot in his works. Um, he's just such an interesting man. He's written 3 books. Waterlog, which is basically a swimmer's journey through the UK. In this, you follow him as he goes swimming in seas and rivers and canals and lakes all throughout the United Kingdom. He also has published one called Wildwood, which is a journey through different woods, mainly in Europe. And then he also has one called Notes from Walnut Tree Farm, which is the house that he is a medieval house. I think that he medieval 16th century house that he renovated. I love these books. I think that they're some of the best nonfiction that you can get if you're interested in nature and nature writing. I could not recommend these more. Right, the last book that I've chosen mainly as an example of a genre of books that I like, and that is A Spy Among Friends by Ben Macintyre. I do read a lot of history. I read my history books slightly different from my others in that usually my main reading time now is of an evening. After I finish work, I've had my dinner, I like to just block out a couple of hours just to kind of get some really like deep kind of involved reading, and I don't have any screens around me. My phone's in a different room. I don't have anything around me to distract me, but I find that doesn't work because when I read history, I like to um, be taking notes of things to like check up on. I like to be looking things up that I don't really know. And so what I do with my history books is that I generally read them a few pages at a time, say maybe 15 to like 25 pages in the mornings before I start work. And then I can kind of check in on things that I'm not sure of, things that I'd like a little bit more information on. This is a great example of history books that I like to read. This is definitely more on the like popular history side. This is an account for anyone who is not familiar with Ben Macintyre, of Kim Philby, who was a Soviet double agent. He defected from Great Britain to the Soviet Union, and he was kind of basically trading secrets to the Soviet Union throughout the Second World War and during the Cold War. Another Ben Macintyre that I love is The Spy and the Traitor, Agent Sonia. There are so many history books that I love. I mainly like history of the 20th century. I also like classics. But yeah, I do read a lot of history. I read it slightly differently, but it is a passion of mine. Right, that is everything. That was quite the rundown. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that you've enjoyed this. And like I said, the next video is going to be a video focused on how I have kind of simplified, I guess is a word I could use, my reading to really focus on deep reading, improve my concentration, reduce distractions, and how that's helped me get more out of my reading over the course of last year and this year too. Right, I hope that you're having a lovely day or a lovely week wherever you are, and I will see you in the next video.